Welcome to the Art of Being Nimble podcast. I'm Glenn Smith and I'm your host. In this series, we'll introduce you to business leaders from around the world who will interview about how they've overcome challenges of operating a business in today's dynamic world. Through their stories, we're going to hear about what problems they've had and how they fixed them and the benefits it's brought them. Importantly, you're going to learn some lessons about what you can then use in your organisation to do similar things. So let's get on with the show and hear the next story. How do you take a simple idea and turn it into an electric vehicle charging network? Well, Richard Stobart did just that. Originally from South Africa and now residing in London, Richard is a serial entrepreneur with experience in agile software development and digital product innovation. As the founder of Unboxed, he established a digital agency that assists organisations in creating and improved digital services. However, his journey took an unexpected turn when he purchased a hybrid Volvo and realised he had no place to charge it. That frustration sparked the concept of Char.gy, a company pioneering lamppost EV charging for drivers lacking off-street parking. But moving from software to hardware meant stepping into the realm of physical prototyping, energy regulations, and local government bureaucracy, where innovation cycles take months rather than minutes. In this episode, Richard shares what it takes to launch a hardware startup, the unexpected challenges of working with local government and regulators, and how agile thinking helped Char.gy stay on course. If you're interested in building products that interact with the real world, this conversation is full of hard-earned lessons. Richard, so what inspired you with the idea of Char.gy? Where did you start?
So I used to drive a diesel Volvo 4x4 around London, lived in a terraced house in London, and Volvo at the time produced a hybrid version and it only had a 20-mile range. So I happened to have some spare time at the time. I had handed over the running of my digital agency to a friend of mine. I was thinking about moving back to South Africa. As it happened, I didn't do that. And so I was kind of kicking around in London with a bit of time on my hands. Unboxed at the time was looking for moving to produce some of its own products. So we went away for a brainstorming week and came up with some ideas. And this was one of them, because to move to the hybrid Volvo with a 20-mile range, my nearest charge point was 3 miles away.
Right.
And so to drive there and back would be 6 miles of the 20 miles that I had available. And so it just wasn't practical to use the electric part of the hybrid. And the problem with hybrids is you are always carrying around extra propulsion and fuel. So either you're carrying around a big diesel engine and a tank full of fuel and using your electric motor, or you're carrying around your electric motor and batteries while using your petrol engine. So they're not super efficient. But to get this 20 miles to work for me and do it, I looked outside my house and there was a lamppost right outside, and I thought, well, yeah, how difficult could it be just to pop a charge point on a lamppost and plug the car into that and charge it up, and then I could drive for 20 miles. And most of the journeys in those days were dropping the kids off at school or down to the shops and that kind of thing. And then for longer journeys, you can use it turns out that it's probably the most difficult type of product, because we sell electricity to consumers, so it's a B2C proposition, but we are reliant on local authorities to buy and install the charge points. So at the moment we fully fund them, but in those days the local authorities were buying them with grants. So you're selling to local government, you're dealing with central government because At the time, they used to be called Office for Low Emission Vehicles. They've subsequently been rebranded as Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. But they are central government trying to help the transition to electric vehicles. You're dealing with the energy sector, and you're dealing with the automotive sector, and you're dealing with physical products and digital products, and a whole lot of regulations and regulators that I had no idea about. And I suppose most startup founders, when asked, would you do the same thing again? They would say, well, if I knew what I know now, I'd never have started the company. But it did take us a while. We had to, you're selling electricity in the public domain. So it's even more complicated than selling a little extension lead because it's out in the rain and the weather and accessible to the public, unmanned. So, and it's high current, 20, 25 amps, which is a decent amount of current, and AC. So complicated and needs to be certified and all the complications around that. So why did we start it? I wanted to buy a hybrid Volvo. And how did we start it? Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about the evolution of the product and how we started with a shoebox. And
so when was this idea of charging outside on the lamppost? When did you have that? What year was it?
I first thought about it probably in 2014. Kicked the idea around for a year or two. I had a friend of mine who was leaving his business and looking for something to get involved in. And so he and I started doing some experiments. Some of the people that worked at Unbox, this digital agency that I started 20 years ago now, Unbox was looking for doing their own product. So their model is a services company that builds products, digital products for other people. And every time you build a digital product, that customer goes off to make lots of money and you go off to look for your next customer. So it'd be nice if we could develop a product using all the skills that we had learned. I was quite heavily involved in the lean startup world. Boxed as a agile digital agency. So we were doing a lot of the stuff with agile and just looking for a new product. So 2016 or so is when we started building the first product. And I think it went onto the first lamppost in Marlow and then in Southwark in 2018.
Okay, so 4 years from idea to being in the wild, being used. Yeah. So I guess it must have been about 2014 when I saw a shoebox version, when I remember being in the office with you and you said, come and look at this. And I was like, what is it? But you sold the vision even then. So, So you talked just now about how many different people and government departments, etc., you had to deal with. But what were some of the biggest technical challenges you had to overcome from that idea of a shoebox to getting it 2016 or 2018 with real users using it?
It was quite a journey because I think, and the biggest part of the journey was learning about hardware.
Okay.
So we're a software agency and all my background was in software. And when you have software, if you find something you want to change, you just make the change and deploy it to production. Whereas hardware, it's slightly longer and slightly more expensive. So if you want to make a change, a little, I shouldn't have put that there, you've got to do a huge iteration. And so I think we were very lucky because we had some fairly dynamic people working in the company. They took on the challenge, and our designer. So one of the problems we had, for example, was you can't very easily buy public lampposts because they sold in sort of lots of 10,000 to the specification of the local authority.
And I guess there's not much call for one in your back garden.
No. So they do sell private lampposts, ornate little things that you can stick in your garden, but the sort of public council specification of them, not easy to find. So we found one in a scrapyard, had the guy cut it in half so it fitted into my diesel Volvo, so I could take it home and experiment on it. But our designer just said, well, let's buy some cardboard and just make a lamppost. So we made a lamppost, a cylinder with some styrofoam top and bottom and cut out. So we just measured a lamppost and made a cardboard equivalent of it. And then we were trying to see if all the components would fit inside the lamppost or not. We had a slight inkling that heat would be a problem. So that was 2016 or so. We did a project a year ago, maybe a bit longer, to try and put the workings of the charge board inside the lamppost, above the bit where it narrows, which is called the swage, word of the day. Swage on a lamppost. So we were trying to get a pipe version of the product to go inside the lamppost to make it nice and neat. And there is a competing product that does that, and it does have heat problems. So if the lamppost is sitting in the sun all day, it gets hot, and then if it's dispensing 25 amps of power, it can't dissipate that heat. So at the time, we had an inkling, but we had no evidence. So we realized the best thing to do would be to build a box on the outside of the lamppost and bolt it to the lamppost in what we call a backpack.
Okay.
So we've now created a new version of that product, which can either go onto the back of the lamppost, opposite the panel, or onto the panel door, depending on the preference of the local authority. That's smaller, so it's probably just slightly bigger than a brick, maybe a brick and a half. Okay. But our original one was a little bit bigger than that. But we used a shoebox to quickly iterate and see if we could fit all the components inside it before we started making plastic versions of it and cardboard versions. And we wanted it to have this sort of angled shape. So we had to figure out how to use 3D software. And then we found a company, fortuitously, that could do 3D printing in aluminium. So they actually produced a 3D printed aluminium version of it. The 3D printer wasn't big enough to print it in the shape that we wanted, in the form that we wanted, with the back and then the lid that went on the front of it. So they had to do it in two halves that sort of fitted together because the machine wasn't big enough. I think technology's moved on in 3D printing. You can print a house these days. But in those days, it wasn't big enough, so we had to. But we got the shape, which was important. And then we found a company that could do sand casting, so we could make a model of it, and that's iterated the product, and we could do a sand cast of it. And sand casting is per unit more expensive, but per batch cheaper. So we could do a small volume run of 5 or 10 charge points in the final design that we wanted using sand casting, and then send those off for certification before we invested huge amounts of money in creating the die to do die casting versions of it. So we kind of use iterative approach and trying to do things as quickly and cheaply as possible, allowing us to make changes as fast as we could while getting a product that we could take to a local authority and put on their desk and say, this is the charge point that's going to go on your lamppost. And that really helped, having a product, and it fitted in a backpack. So my first council visit was to Islington Council, I think, and then I went to Marlow, and they made me walk around Marlow. Luckily, the charge point was quite light because I had it in my backpack for 2 or 3 hours walking around Marlow. And then I pulled it out and said, here's the charge point. So I've been carrying it around, and they were just blown away by its size and how small it was.
Oh, amazing.
So these days it's not a big deal, but in those days it was.
It was, I say, you were pushing technology. So mindful that you come from a software background, Unbox digital agency, very experienced creating products for others in software. What was your challenges about? What skills did you need to go and get to support you in doing a physical product? Because it is different.
It is different, yes. So we found someone who was a qualified Siemens engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And so he helped us build our first working charge point using a Siemens set of components.
Yeah.
There, at the time, there was a YouTube video of someone building a charge point using a sort of homemade controller, mm-hmm. which we bought online and pulled together. The homemade one wasn't safe, so the BEMA, who are the trade body for charge point manufacturers, produced a statement saying, don't use this; it's not safe. The Siemens one was too expensive, and then we found a company in Berlin that made the controller. So mm-hmm. we used them for the controller, which is the kind of brains of it, and all the other components off the shelf. We obviously had this guy who was the electrical designer who helped us build the first charge point. So we did the mechanical side of it, 3D printing, and then sand casting. We did the electrical design with this mm-hmm. guy. He put it all together and sent it off for certification. The certification itself, at the time, BSI weren't quite ready to certify charge points. There was an awkward discussion where they were telling us that we didn't have to do certain tests. And I was saying, I'm sure in the standards that it says you do have to do those tests. They've come along a huge way, and we now use BSI for our testing. But mm-hmm. in those days, we had to use UL in the States. So we had to send our charge points off. It's like sending your newborn baby unattended to another country. And that was a learning curve that was really hard to get through certification. Mm. But actually, the product didn't change. So it was failing. And then this design engineer went across and sat with them and watched them execute the tests. And when he was sitting there watching, they all passed. So we're not quite sure why they didn't pass initially, but as soon as you watch the tests, they passed. And so we had to pay for 3 iterations of certification, which was a bit frustrating. But we got them certified, and then we also had to get a council to get them onto a lamppost. And we had Richmond interested in running a trial. And they said, well, the one problem is you need to work out how you're going to charge for the electricity. And we went to Ofgem, and they were creating the sandbox for new energy companies. So they were trying to help us get into the sandbox and use the sandbox. And they went away and did a paper for us. The R&D team did a paper for us, and they came back. And the conclusion was that actually Ofgem is not our regulator because lampposts are unmetered. So we had to go to different regulator, Lexon, and get the certification, and that took a bit of time. Mm-hmm. But everyone was like really positive about the idea and enthusiastic and helping us. So we really did have a lot of interest from government and regulators and the DNOs and everyone trying to help, because everyone was excited about this idea to help. There's something like 30 or 40% of UK vehicle owners don't have off-street parking. And that's a huge number. And if you're trying to shift everyone to EVs, you've got to solve that problem.
Absolutely. But
so everyone was really enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, some of the problems that you're articulating, I guess, that's a lot of that's going to come from being very frontier-like with new technology. But it's heartwarming to know that actually in that sort of area that the government agencies and regulators were actually supportive and potentially to a layman sound uncharacteristically supportive of what people imagine regulators to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, Ofgem was interesting because at first, we contacted them. We contacted the one company in the UK that could have done the work for us, and they said they've been engaged by our competition, so they can't help us. So then we went to Ofgem, and they were surprised that we were actually contacting them. They were like, well, normally people just do it, and then we intervene and say, you can't do that, or we adjust the regulations. It's unusual for someone to come and ask us how we do it. So and then we got passed on to the Departments of Weights and Measures, who were doing what an electricity meter needed to be. Yeah, so really, really interesting. And we had a MID meter in the charge point. We had it on our desk, and we had one of the DNOs, UK Power Networks, come in, and the Elexon guy come in, and we had the charge point open and the meter inside, and they looked inside and said, oh, it's got a meter. Yes, it's got a meter. So we can obviously meter and charge for the energy, which is one of the things. And they were like, you can't connect a meter to an unmetered supply. So you can't have a meter. And if you do put a meter on, then UK Power Networks were saying, well, then it's different regulation and the meter has to be a certain height and accessible. And they're like, right. So we ended up changing it for a measuring device and going through a whole lot of certification to get that measuring device working.
So were there, in that early stage, while you were going through the prototyping, were there any failures or moments where you went home and thought, I'm wasting my time here, this is never going to work? Or did you always hold the faith?
I think we always held the faith. There were some stumbling blocks, like when we had sent our product off to be certified and it failed certification for reasons that we couldn't understand. And it was failing EMC, which is quite sort of nebulous anyway. And we didn't know why. And we were testing it in the UK for EMC, and it was passing. And it turned out that the cable they were using had a dodgy connection. So it wasn't the charge point, it was the cable that they were plugging in to generate the load. And the cable itself was acting as an antenna. Yeah. So, quick trip down to, probably bought it online, and new cable, and it worked a treat. Yeah. So when certification failed, when we were waiting for the outcome of the Ofgem consultation piece, and then found out that we had to speak to, I can't remember the person's name, but the person who ran Weights and Measures, and he was on holiday for six weeks. Everything taking much longer, and the council's like wanting to run the trial, and more interest building up. So there were barriers, and then we had to apply for GULC's Go Ultra Low City Scheme, which London got, I can't remember the exact amount, 5.3 million, I think, to spend on charge points. And so we had to prove that we had all the credentials. So we found a company that we're still working with today called Sigma, who do our installations for us. And they were fantastic at the time and very, very patient with us, waiting for the volume of installations to pick up. And they waited years. Their waiting's paid off now, but they were very patient with us and helped us install the first ones, and working with us to solve those problems, and helping us submit this bid. So it was a 60 or 80 page set of requirements and a subsequent sort of 100-page written response to the bid. And we were one of the 4 companies that got in. I think actually 3, there were 4 places and 1 dropped out right at the last minute. So yeah, that was a big step forward, but that almost killed us. And then we were running out of money as well and needed to scale up. And it took us a bit of time, but we found Zook, who run the ChargePoint Infrastructure Investment Fund and have got loads of experience investing in ChargePoint infrastructure. And so they were the perfect investor for us, finding that investment took time and energy. And at the same time, we were doing an induction UK, Innovate UK funded induction charging project, so public induction pads where you could just park. So we're converting little Renault Zoes to charge using induction and putting them in a car club and having people drive them and park them on the induction pads and recharging them. And we were trying to deliver that project, trying to survive through trying to get our charge points on the streets and trying to fundraise at the same time. That was tough times. But
a lot of moving parts. You must
yes.
You must have had to build a good management team around you, Richard.
I was very, very lucky that we had some great people that worked at Unboxed that were moved across. So Unboxed sort of divided the people into people that were seconded to Char.gy and working, and Unboxed was supplying sweat equity by paying everyone's salaries, not making a profit for several years while we drained them dry, and then also taking on running Unboxed because we all were 100% focused on Char.gy. So I would say that it's really expensive to build a hardware product, and you've got to have you can't just start in your garage with no wealthy friends and no clever people around you and do it by yourself and bootstrap. That's really difficult. I think we were exceptionally lucky to be able to have Unboxed that was notionally generating a profit, but was willing to throw all that profit into sustaining Char.gy. And then I also had this friend of mine who was investing and giving us some capital that we could, spend externally on the molds and producing the first 100 or so charge points. And then also some customers who wanted the technology. And so we had some very early traction from Southwark, from Coventry, from Buckinghamshire, who were willing to trial a sort of experimental product.
Yeah, that must be, we were saying, if you're having a great product, but if you don't have anyone wants to use it, or you need the councils to be brave enough to trial it.
Yes.
It's interesting you talk about you need deep pockets to do that. It feels like the complexity of technology today and regulatory requirements, which probably, if anything physical, will have some form of approvals in some shape or form it needs to meet. It's so much harder than you hear the stories, when it was Steve Jobs and Wozniak doing the little phone dialers back in their garage in the 60s. It's a completely different kettle of fish. So you talked about, just want to go back to the iterative and agile development process. So again, agile or software agile experience. What were the big adaptations or learnings you had applying the principles that you've tried time and time again, that work, to a solution that is not as malleable as software and much more physical in its nature?
I guess the problem with hardware is you've kind of got to define all your features up front, because you can't have something that's unsafe or doesn't work or, so your minimum viable product is quite a large part of the product. So I suppose we were running experiments on the viability of the product, and we were talking to councils before we actually had a product, and we were producing, so like the 3D printed version of it in aluminium, we could actually build a charge point that charged a car, and we could take it to a council and show them it on a lamppost. And we hadn't done all the things that we needed to do, so it wasn't certified, it wasn't in the right form factor, even though it looked right. It was in these two half boxes that fitted together. We didn't have a way to bill for the energy, etc., etc. So the features weren't totally complete, but the council could see what it looked like. So it's powder coated in anti-graffiti paint, but you can actually specify the color. And so we spent a lot of time and effort creating a product that looked like we thought the councils wanted it, and we showed it to them, and they said, "Yeah, can you do it in black?" Like, yeah, can do it in black. So there were those sort of taking shortcuts where we could to prove that there was a need. But then when you actually came to deploy the product, it had to be fully featured. So there are a couple of features that we've subsequently added to the product, and we've now done an iteration of the product so it's smaller and lighter and fits on lampposts. But those product release cycles are really long, much longer than software. Our software, we use a continuous deployment approach. So you make a change, you run all the automated tests, or you update the tests, run all automated tests. If it passes, it gets merged into the head and deployed to production. And so software changes are happening all the time. Little hardware changes are happening, but you've got this hurdle of certification. So you've got to do a risk assessment by a qualified engineer. Now we've got a whole host of qualified engineers to do our risk assessments for us, and we're working with some great third-party design companies who do all sorts of interesting other products like marine and CERN. They do some work at CERN and stuff, and they do some of the design work for our charge points. But to make those little changes, is a big hurdle. And because you've got to change where you can buy the components, how they all fit in, what the heat profile is of it, waterproofing, supply chain, is the supply chain robust enough? Complicated compared to software.
And did you have to therefore put in more rigorous process to make sure that if changes were being made, that you were still going to be compliant and you didn't wake up with expensive gotchas 7 months down the road?
Yes, and we had to go through that learning process because you can buy books on software development, but I haven't found a book on how to start a hardware product and move it through to certification and create a library of, when we sent the product off for certification, the first thing they asked for was our library of all the certificates and technical specifications of all the components that we bought off the shelf or bought for websites. And although they branded products, it's really difficult to find the exact product number and the certificate for it and the certificate of compliance for it and build a library of that. Maybe that's my next book, how to build a software product and a hardware product and how to get ready for certification. If we were smarter at the time. My friend Dan North talks about how your knowledge goes up in big steps, and when you start a project, you are the least knowledgeable you're going to be, and you can either iterate where your steps of learning are fast and small, or you have these huge steps of learning where you realize that you do need to do EMC testing and you've no idea what EMC stands for. That's a big step.
And I'm assuming, from some of the things that you've already said, it sounds like some of those steps did feel like big steps. But do you think in hindsight, applying those agile techniques that you've been using for years, at least you could see where you were trying to make some baby steps along the more substantive ones that you needed, that you were dictated to because of the hardware nature?
Yeah, I think so. I went on an accelerator, can't remember the name of the university that was giving it, but they talked about the guy that was delivering it delivered this product, which was a light for Africa. And you basically put stones in a bucket, and overnight the stones pulled down and generated electricity, which ran the light. And when the stones reached the ground, you took them out, pulled the bucket up again, put the stones back in, and so your light would generate light at night. And that was the product he was working on. And he took us through all the details of like all the documentation you needed and the various changes and experimentation of the product and stuff. So you can certainly do that. And I think our product is actually reasonably simple as a product. There's no, you can just go online and see a design of a charge point online. There's not a lot of new stuff, and it is off-the-shelf components that would be almost impossible for us to go and build ourselves. You do want to use off-the-shelf components and just pulling them all together. But there is a process that you need to go through, as I said, that's like longer and more difficult. And it's got to all fit together, and you've got to do things like think about your cabling thickness and heat and bend radiuses and EMC about where the components sit inside and all sorts of things, and the correct colors of the cables and the waterproofness of each of the components and the longevity of it, and how all the seals work and how would you access it to service it, all that sort of thing. That is just almost endless. We're still learning today, even though we've got 3 or 4 versions of our product now. We're still there.
And does anything particularly surprise you when you started, and it was around 2018 when you sort of got it in the wild and people started using it? Were there any sort of usability things that really surprised you when Joe Public started using your product in anger?
I suppose that bit was the really easy bit for us.
Okay.
So we were quite unique in that most charge point operators and manufacturers at the time, and maybe still to some extent today, they had come from the hardware side. So they had built the charge point, cobbled together some software, and there were lots and lots of feedback in the press about, everyone has to download an app and the apps don't work and the charge points don't work. And we could test our software because that was our standard process. And so our software, we've never really had a problem with our software ever. We did have a deployment issue on it. So our software works on a website, so you don't need the app, but we do have an app now, and something went wrong with the release to the app store of the app. And so we had to reverse that out, and there was a couple of hours of downtime, and the mobile network that we use, which is a special IoT network for mobile, occasionally goes down. But our back office, I don't think we've ever had an outage, which is amazing. And all the feedback we get on our app, the users love it, or they're complaining about something slightly beyond our control, like there's a car parked where they want to charge.
If you could control that through software, Richard, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about agility from an R&D point of view, but what about agility from a company point of view? Because obviously Char.gy's been very, very doing really well and getting bigger. How do you maintain the agility within the enterprise?
So it's difficult, but we are really still quite a small company. So we're growing really fast, and we do have lots of teams, but our biggest teams are sales, who work in a really agile way, the installers, who ticket-based really, and our software developers who work in an agile way. So, and then all the other departments are relatively smaller than that. We don't have many layers of management. We've got a guy called John Lewis, who's now our CEO and getting us ready for the next stage of growth, which is underway and happening. But John's outlook is very similar to mine. I think he's much better at the scale part than I ever was, but he's kept that culture of doing what's most necessary and most urgent, and not wasting time on doing things that aren't yet necessary and urgent.
Brilliant. So my last question then for you, Richard, is that if you were going to give some advice to someone launching a hardware startup today, what would it be?
Don't choose one that needs sell to government in the public domain, B2C, energy, transport, local governments and central governments, if at all possible. But I suppose the advice would be to try and validate before you spend big chunks of money, iterate and validate everything that you're going to do. And your customers are your best advocates, especially if they're not consumers, but, like we went to local authorities and we had a couple of local authorities where we could take them our 3D model of the product and have a conversation with them about how it would go on the lamppost and how it would attach, and they were bought into that. They were part of the journey, and they still are. There's customers that we are doing new experimental stuff with to push the boundaries of what's possible, and they're part of that journey. So, get those customer advocates on board and don't feel that you need to go with a fully working, fully certified, fully fledged product and spend hundreds of thousands of your investors or friends' money developing that isn't what they wanted. So try and do it as leanly as possible, and also get a good team around you.
Yeah, it does sound like you've had a good team based on what you've told us so far.
Yeah, and I think so it's difficult to find people in the charging infrastructure domain, especially a couple of years back, but you can look at parallel industries. So we looked at wind farms. So our CFO comes from wind farms. Our CEO comes from mobile devices on lampposts. And our CTO comes from a digital agency, Unboxed, but he also worked on gov.uk. So he did part of the design team on gov.uk. So that sort of public-facing, public service stuff. Yeah, so they look just outside your industry and parallel industries to find your team. And also, I suppose the other thing, you asked me a question earlier about were there any low points. You've certainly got to have the resilience. Lots of people tell you that your product's not going to work, and you've just got to be a little bit bulletproof and have the faith. And I think that's probably the startup entrepreneur, maybe not so much scale-up entrepreneur, but startup needs to have faith that the product is going to succeed, and every barrier can be broken down and will be broken down. Whereas people in more sort of stable jobs and less of a appetite for risk will maybe say, well, no, that's not going to work. And then you throw 3 or 4 ideas at them and get them thinking about solutions, move them to a solution-based mindset, and then they become part of the solution. And then, because the human brain loves solving problems, what we're really good at. And when you're solving a problem, so if you explain the problem and then give them some ideas, and I'm really good at ideas, and maybe a quarter of them work, but I can throw out a lot of ideas, and that motivates the team, because then they feel ownership of the idea, they come up with a solution.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Richard. It's been great to hear your journey, and all the success with Char.gy in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I've had fun making it. I'd be thrilled to hear your feedback or suggestions for topics you'd like me to explore. Email the show at podcast@nimbility.co. You can also check out all the other episodes in the series at nimbility.co/podcast. If you've enjoyed the content, it would mean a lot to us if you could subscribe and rate the show in your podcast app. Your support helps others discover the show and allows us to keep spreading the word. So until next time, thanks for listening.